Lamento no poder estar presente, pero es un honor hablar con ustedes. En 2011 asistí a una conferencia en la Ciudad de México, en la que disfruté del alto nivel de erudición, además del bien compañerismo. Por lo tanto, estoy con ganas de volver a México y oír cosas maravillosas acerca de la ciudad de Puebla, y espero regresar ahí pronto. Enseño una gran variedad de cosas sobre las Américas en mi curso de la historia de California, y quisiera suscitar más conexiones entre norte y sur. I speak now not so much about the reception of logic, but instead about the ways it could be molded on the American frontier to fulfill specific educational purposes. I will give 4 examples of Renaissance humanist practices of the British who came rather late to North America. I suspect that there are much earlier examples of similar types of textbooks being composed and for a specific purpose among the humanists of Latin America. So, to begin, Increase Mather, president of Harvard from 1686 to 1701, author of one of the 4 books I will be talking to you about, declared that his university followed the tradition of the Eclectics. He traced the term back to the philosophical sect led by Potamon in ancient Greece, who adhered to no former sect. They chose out of them all what they liked best. Harvard students, Mather declared, adopted a liberal mode of philosophizing. Mather insisted that students were pledged to the formulas of no master. In this speech, Mather espoused the general principle of eclectic education in New England that was rooted in Renaissance humanism. Now, not only was the whole school to be eclectic in trying to not promote any one form of logic, each individual tutor was encouraged to not be not to be stuck with one person, one school of thought. And so the tutor was supposed to teach a number of different things, and then tutors were encouraged to write their own textbooks, of which they were to be specifically useful to the students that they had in their classrooms. And so from an educational standpoint, the goal of the tutor was to gather out of various sources a textbook to meet specific local needs and promote specific local purposes. Okay. Now, 3 of the books I'm going to talk about are not formally published. They are published in a way that has become called scribal publication. Scribal publication is that the students would transcribe what the teacher had written into their own notebooks. And then these student notebooks had a life of their own in which for 20, 30 years, different generations of students would transcribe one textbook from their notebooks to others. And so we have multiple copies of lots of these textbooks that students wrote. And we have a number of logic textbooks, and I'm going to give you 3 that were scribally published for use at Harvard. And then we'll talk about the one that was published formally was the one for Indians. So, to begin, let's talk about the Indian text. When the Puritans migrated to New England in the 17th century, they created what might be considered the most literate society in all of the earth. Not only were there more university graduates per capita than any comparable place, these Puritans founded a university almost immediately within the first decade. Harvard was founded in 1636. And they wrote laws that every town must have a school in order for students to have the opportunity to learn to read, write, and do arithmetic. And this is both girls and boys for the most part. They offered schools that were better for the boys to go on to grammar and Latin and maybe on to Harvard. but all were to be literate. Okay, and this is not just girls and boys of the English, this is also for the Indians. The Indians were to be educated too. In 1649, a group of investors in Britain formed a company called the New England Company, which was devoted to supporting the creation of what were called praying towns. These are Indian towns. Puritans in that Renaissance humanist way are very oriented toward towns. Towns have schools. They create these praying towns where they gather the Indians in, and the praying towns all have schools and churches. And so in these praying towns, there was a great hope that the Indians would become educated. And then like the boys in the regular towns, there would be access to a town, to going to Harvard eventually. Once they learned their English, then their Latin, then they could go to Harvard. It was hoped that Indians would become then teachers and pastors and become a self-perpetuating, indigenous group, expanding their own Christianity throughout New England. Okay. Harvard, it was hoped, would train both Indians and white people to be these leaders in society and the teachers in all of the schools. So when Harvard drafted its second charter in 1650, it stated what were the colony's goals, which was the education of the English and Indian youth of the country in knowledge and godliness. Now this godliness is going to be a key to the purpose because these are Puritans, and so these logic textbooks are going to be directed and oriented, all four of them, for a specific purpose of supporting Protestant, especially Puritan-style Protestantism. But it's going to be in different ways for Harvard. They'll be, and it makes them quite distinctive, these logic textbooks. So, over the next course of 150 years, there were only about 4 Indian students who went into Harvard, made it that far. But a lot of Indians, apparently upwards of close to 200 over the colonial period, were educated in their praying towns. Some seem to maybe have gone to the other grammar schools at Roxbury and Cambridge, and there was created an educational environment in these praying towns. Now, I've given you a PowerPoint. I can't see it from where I'm at, but it's first off, it's the title of this published Indian logic, a logic primer. And then if you go to the next slide, what you see is a map of the Indian towns and a picture of John Eliot. The dots here show these Indian towns. Natick, where John Eliot was, is up near Boston. And from that town there, it spread. What we've got is a very great source, which was Daniel Gookin, traveled around in the 1670s. And he wrote describing for the New England Company what was going on in New England among the Indians. And he does lots of different things. But he talks about specifically John Eliot teaching in Natick and teaching his students. And they were learning to be able to speak methodically and profitably on any plain text of Scripture. And that's what this logic teaches, is if we go through some examples here of the actual text, you'll see it. There's first just terms, and then at the end actually question and answers about baptism, and these are all to be derived from the biblical text. And so it's really training. The logic is to learn to read the Scripture. Okay. Now, there's about 1,000 of these were printed, and they were paid for by the New England Company. And as best we can tell, if we want, this is my only point really about the reception of logic, is that the Algonquin speaking, these are the Wampanoag Indians, and they all have their separate dialects, but this text was then able to be spread, and the Indians who from Natick then moved out to teach in their separate towns. And so over the course of the next 50 years or so, this text actually spread and was used by Indians to teach Indians at the very first level so that they could eventually become teachers and pastors within these praying towns as they moved along. So it was probably very successful. It's very hard to chart these things. So That's the first one. That's the first text. It's a very interesting text, and it is published and available on microfilm and easily had. The rest of these are in manuscript, and they're published in the one is in translation. You can get them I actually have done the transcriptions of them, so you can get them from publications that I've done. Now, so the second one, let's talk about a scribally published Ramist catechism. Now, in 1661, a student was opening a letter from his uncle, and his uncle wrote to him, says that above all at Harvard, you should learn the method of the incomparable Ramus and study every art that he has written upon. And he says, get his definitions and distributions into your mind and your memory. Okay, memorize this. Now, at this time, the logic system by Peter Ramus was nearing the end of its 100-year popularity in Europe. But Leonard Hoare, this guy who wrote this letter, would become president of Harvard. And so Harvard continues the Ramist tradition longer than the Europeans do normally. And then in 1675, Hoare is actually fired, and Increase Mather, who will eventually come in as president, writes a textbook in 1675. And what he calls it is a Catechismus Logicus. And he then specifically says it's drawn from Peter Ramus, Alexander Richardson, William Ames, and that it is collected, most diligently collected, for the use of pupils at Harvard. If you go to the next slide here, you'll see a portrait of Increase Mather, a very dynamic man. And then he wrote this on two mornings, April 26th and 27th of 1675. We have it in his diary. He sat down and wrote up this short catechism, question and answers. It would be primarily for the use of his son. Now, what you see on the here is one of these manuscript texts. We have this text in two versions, two different student versions from Harvard, and you can see the student doodling and all that sort of stuff. At the top, Catechismus Logicus, and then the statement of who it's drawn from, who it's plucked from, eclectically pulled together, and then this statement that it's for the use of the students. Okay, and it was never printed. It was always just done in manuscript. So Increase Mather chose to do this largely because he had a hope, especially beginning in 1675 when Harvard was falling apart. He had a hope that he could rebuild Harvard and centralize Harvard into a full university system in which the students would come in at age 10, 11, 12, and then they'd graduate with a PhD. And so this text here seems to have been part of a program in his mind. He had a full program for what he hoped Harvard would be. He wanted it to be like a Dutch university in which it would pull in students at a very young age. And so this would be their first logic textbook, would be a catechism where they could memorize Ramist logic. Now, Ramist logic is it's a humanist form of pedagogy, which was very popular. The humanists, largely in the spirit of Lorenzo Valla and Rudolf Agricola, had tried to simplify logic. Medieval logic, they believed, was too complex. For schools, we need to simplify it. And Ramus had gone much further in this zeal to simplify logic. And he did this most famously in his Dialecticae Libri Duo. What we have to remember about Ramist logic is it's not a very distinctive logic itself in its content. It's its structure. The structure of simplification, how he organized it. He organized it in two books, and then he dichotomized everything. Everything was cut into two. And so, frankly, this is a bit laughable. And there were many people who criticized him. Thomas Reid in the 18th century, a Scottish philosopher, criticized him as saying that it's as if he had his Ramist dichotomy. It's as if one should divide England into Middlesex and what is not Middlesex. And so, this is why Ramus logic didn't last long. It didn't work well, but it was good for little kids. Lisa Jardine sums up the best modern scholarship when she notes that Ramus was primarily an aggressive pedagogical reformer who did not make any significant innovations in the content of logic, but did this pedagogical reform. So Ramus's dialectic Libri Duo manifests a reductionist attitude with the goal of meeting the needs of art students at the first degree level. And it teaches them the bare minimum to enable them to carry out the academic exercises required of them. So this is the purpose. This is one of the key purposes that it's being directed. So Ramus had created this logic, and then Increased Mather is going to primarily takes from Ramus himself, but he has William Ames, he has Alexander Richardson. He's going to pluck and pick and choose, and he's affirming that he has this right and ability to, as the tutor, to create this little logic textbook which will be used by first-year youngest students. Now Milton, John Milton, George Downham, a number of people, Alexander Richardson himself, believed that Ramus had actually simplified things too much. But, and that they believed you had to build these expanded logic textbooks. And so those people, as tutors in England, had written much larger expanded Ramus texts. But, I have a quote here from Milton. Milton says, "What's the use of achieving brevity if it means we must go elsewhere for clarification?" So, putting all the emphasis on the book itself. What Mather did was go the absolute opposite direction. Let's shrink this down to a bare minimum. And what that does is then put a lot of emphasis on the teacher. The teacher becomes the person who explains this. So you students copy it out, you memorize it, you memorize what the text is, it's a memorizable size, but then the teacher will help you explain the catechism, help you understand the question and answers. So this was Increased Mather's purpose behind this Ramus catechism. So we've got the Indian one, in which it's very minimalist and directed toward specifically Indian education. It seems to have been very successful in that. And then you have this one that was rooted at the very base of Increased Mather's reform. Now, Increased Mather's reforms for the university never fully worked out. So this textbook of Mather's was probably not very popular. And Ramism itself was declining and falling. So let's go on to our third textbook now. And the third textbook is an Aristotelian textbook. It goes back through a series of Aristotelian writers, that, primarily back to Philip Melanchthon. Melanchthon, along with Agricola, two of the great sort of pedagogical reformers of the 16th century, early and late 15th century, had both, and they're often written about together as they're working in a sort of more probabilistic structure. They're sort of helping the Renaissance become more open to various ideas and to become more skeptical. Okay. Well, this is somewhat true of Agricola's text, but if you read Melanchthon's text, it's very different. Melanchthon also, cutting and pasting from Cicero and Quintilian and Aristotle's Topics, Boethius, different things, puts together an Aristotelian form of textbook, which is characteristically different from Agricola's in that it offers a much stronger, powerful backing to the Lutheran Reformation. And Melanchthon, of course, was Martin Luther's right-hand man. So Melanchthon had created this logic. He's incredibly popular. Melanchthon himself becomes a very, very popular tutor and teacher. And then many, many people in the Renaissance humanist tradition, Keckerman and all these other people, are producing textbooks that cut and paste from Melanchthon. And then in the third generation, you get this sort of English bunch that are sort of mixing and matching quite a bit. And so you get a real mishmash, sort of what's sometimes called a Filippo-Ramus, connections and stuff. And then Charles Morton. Charles Morton is this very interesting guy. Charles Morton was the teacher at an academy in London, South London, in what's called Newington Green, a place where the Puritans really hung out very tightly. And in Newington Green, he had put together a school that had became famous as a Puritan school. He himself started at Cambridge, but had moved over to Oxford. And Oxford had this Aristotelian tradition of textbooks, like what we're talking about here, but much more sophisticated at Oxford. And then he had written a whole textbook series, a whole textbook cycle for his students there. In 1686, his school is shut down in England. And so therefore he is sent to, he comes to America in the hope of getting involved in Harvard, but he's actually too famous to be involved at Harvard. Harvard wants to sort of keep down low. But he becomes very influential, and all of his textbooks come into Harvard's curriculum, and especially this logic textbook, which was his most innovative textbook. One of the things that's most innovative about it is that he wanted it for both boys and girls. He didn't want it just for the academic setting, so he wrote it in English, the vulgar tongue. He writes a preface in which he says very straight up, I want this to be widely read. I want this to be read by girls. And he says in it that he wants to encourage, this thinking. He's got a very broad purpose at a very sort of low level, not as low as that Rammus Catechism, but at another level where children in the schools, boys and girls, are going to have access to this. So it's not just a college text. And then pedagogically, he has this very interesting structure in which he picks up on three different traditions and merges them. One is he has the prose tradition, which he explains something. Then he has a diagram, which goes back to like Cassiodorus and these others in the medieval tradition. People have these extensive diagrams. He has extensive diagrams. And for each section, there's a diagram. So there's a prose section, a diagram, then he has a poem. And so the same content in all three, but you then you have in different forms. So it helps the students memorize. And the most interesting section of it for the Puritans, and why you can see this became a popular text among the Puritans. You have this Rammus text that you start out with, but here's an Aristotelian text, is that in the 10 predicaments, in the 10 categories, there's the category of quality. And one of the things that Melanchthon had done was pick up on the idea of habit within quality and use that as a place to talk about Augustinian psychology. Why people become Christians, why they assent to faith, and that there's this infused will in a person. Now, if you go to the PowerPoint, this next PowerPoint that hopefully you're seeing, you'll see Melanchthon on one side. And this is his category of quality. And what I've done is I've simply diagrammed how he structures it. And if you follow it down, you'll see that it carries on down to a place where it talks about how you're this infused will that helps you from God. It's a grace that helps you then assent to true and firm knowledge. Okay. On the side of Morton, you see how he uses the same thing. He has grace. He's eclectic. He's picking and choosing from other people too, but he's working primarily from this tradition created by Melanchthon to follow down through this system, which leads to there is this infused faith that's you can be absolutely confident, you have absolute certainty in divine testimony. Interestingly enough, Melanchthon includes the church. He was very interested in the ecclesia being part of the authority structure for divine testimony. And typical of the Puritans, Morton takes out the church. Morton does not mention the church, it's directly into the individual. So it's a very interesting text and specifically designed to bring Aristotelianism into the curriculum. Okay, finally I'm going to go to the fourth text. And I'm not following my notes here at all. Let's go on. The fourth text is a Cartesian text, and it was written by a guy named William Brattle. William Brattle was 24 years old when Charles Morton came to New England in 1686, and as a young, he had just been appointed a tutor, and it's through him probably that Morton's text immediately got into the classrooms, because apparently William Brattle, much impressed by Morton, and obviously should have been, and was very favorable to this. And so Morton would have been taught by Brattle in various forms, but then in the eclecticism of the curriculum, you want the new philosophy. And probably Morton encouraged Brattle himself to write a logic textbook which was Cartesian. Okay. Now, in doing this, Brattle wrote a compendium of logic according to the modern philosophy, extracted from, and this is typical, you know, just like Mather talked about collecting and extracting, this is extracted from Legrand and others. Basically, this is all from Legrand's Institutio Philosophiae, which is and Legrand was a Catholic, and also the Jansenist Port Royal logic is actually what Legrand used. So it really mostly goes back to the Port Royal logic's interpretation of Cartesianism. Now, this idea of like gathering and collecting, this is this commonplace book tradition that students are all being encouraged to write commonplace books where they gather quotes and then they reorganize these quotes. In the European tradition, this was often called florilegia or anthologia, anthologies and florilegias. And the picturing there is with flowers, and you know, you go out into the flower fields and you pluck. This is this eclecticism. You pluck what's out there and you bring it together and you put it into a text. And then it becomes useful to you. There's a personal usefulness to you. Now the tutor goes out and plucks and picks, and it becomes personally useful to his students. And this is what's very clearly when you look at these. Authorship is a very loose idea, and no one is pretending that these are their books. This is this is a compendium of logic, a compendium of it, synopsis of it. A synopsis is another term that's often used in the English versions. And then it's extracted. It's extracted from Legrand, Antoine Legrand, and Antoine Arnaud's Port Royal logic. So Port Royal logic had been written primarily for the little schools that the Jansenists had created. It had first been written for the Duke's child, I think, in Valley of Chevreau. And Arnaud was the principal author of it. When the schools were repressed, I think 1659, the books were repressed also. But the little schools, they were popular and they spread. And so eventually, in about 1662, Arnaud and probably others published what got called the Port Royal logic, often in Latin called the Ars Cogitandi. And this spread throughout Europe. For 200 years, this book was incredibly popular, very influential. And what we see in New England is a Puritan picking up on this Catholic and implanting him into the Puritan side of things. And then Legrand was a Recollect. He had been born in Douai, France, had joined the Recollect, a strict part of the Franciscan order, and then had gone as a missionary to Oxfordshire, England. And so his book was written for English people in Oxford to have, and especially some of these Catholic families where he was a tutor and stuff. So here we have a Puritan in New England, William Brattle, very pious young man, wanting to bring over the new philosophy, and especially all the vigor of that, because the Ramist and the Aristotelian are actually a little more enclosed here. The vigor of Cartesianism was his inquiry, that we can go out and discover new things. He wants to bring this over, and he does so by picking and choosing from these Roman Catholic texts. Brattle wrote in his introduction, he says, the object of logic is everything knowable, everything that is maybe proposed to the understanding of man. Not as if logic did instruct the mind about the nature of things or any one thing. That's the design of philosophy. But it does make the way clear for knowledge in general and delivers such precepts as may direct and assist the mind when inquiring into the nature of anything whatever. Of the four logics I'm discussing, Mather's Ramist logic and Brattle's Cartesian logic are what we might say the least eclectic, because they're tightly from one source, the Ramist source, and then Arnaud and Legrand in the Catholic Cartesian tradition. So they're the least eclectic, but this one, its purpose is the grandest. The Brattle's is he wants to inspire students, and this goes with the Enlightenment's coming. Harvard really is going to make a sea change, and Brattle becomes an inspiration to students about the sort of forwardness of knowledge and the growth of knowledge, and so fits into that whole new philosophy. And so he picks up on that. But what he also picks up on, and very important in the text, is that he does not want you to start thinking too skeptically. He believes that Descartes has given us very, very strong foundation. Descartes, through Arnaud, has given this very strong foundation for intellectual confidence in Orthodox Christianity. Now, of course, Arnaud used a lot of Catholic examples, say also in the Institutio Philosophiae by Legrand. These Catholic examples. It's very easy for Brattle to simply change the Catholic examples into Protestant examples. He keeps the whole structure. This is part of that eclecticism, you know, sort of redirect it to a new purpose. These Catholic texts, we're going to redirect them to the Puritans. But what Brattle did is use the four-part structure, which Arnaud had developed and then John Locke and other people use. And so right reason begins with perception, moves to judgment, then to discourse, and then finally, section 4, method. All right? And Brattle says, by the first, we are put upon attention and consideration. By the second, we are freed from doubts and errors. By the third, we are accustomed to reason. And by the fourth, we infallibly prove the truth and demonstrate the same to others. Now, Descartes had created the rules of direction of the mind, and this had been going around in manuscript, and Arnaud had access to the manuscript of this, and he published a version of those rules in his Ars Cogitandi, in which there are 10 of these rules. Legrand has 8 of these rules. Brattle puts the 8 at the front and the 10 at the back. Here again, it's very eclectic, obviously pulling from these two, but he likes this rules for the direction of the mind and method, getting out and his belief that fair people, this is Brattle's terms, fair people using their native wit can achieve intellectual confidence. Now, I've given you a diagram here at the end here, which is Barbara Shapiro is a scholar, an excellent scholar at University of California, Berkeley. And she has done a couple different major studies of English 17th century thought, especially about probability and certainty, about how it was used in law and science and religion and other things. Yes, and what I've done here is given a diagram which she gives of how certainty works. And if you notice at the top of hers, there's God's knowledge, but there's no method to getting it. And that's absolutely certain, but humans don't have a method of getting it. And then, and this is the common thing going on, the tendency of English logic textbooks, the tendency of English thought. And then if you go down, so belief, religious belief is down there, and if you cross over to the certainty level, it's moral certainty at best. Now, if you go to Brattle's degrees of ascent, what you see is at the top is science, but then there's also a special kind of faith, and this is knowledge revealed. This is divine testimony. And then if you go across, you have a method, and then it yields absolute certainty. The method is derived from clear divine testimony, which can stand alone as a conclusion or serve as an axiom of science. And for Brattle, he talks about this as being from the Bible and in the standard Puritan way. So here you see the Brattle's text is, if you were just sort of to cursory look at it, you know, there's all these new philosophy textbooks and there's all sorts of logic textbooks in England. What you have to do is not just look at the framework and structure of it, but go into the section on assent. And if you look at the section on assent and actually look at how assent works, you can see how the tutors writing their textbooks, these little targeted textbooks to individual places. This is a Puritan textbook which says the exact opposite of what's being said in a lot of other texts. So this is my point about being eclectic and then also purposeful. Is this is the fun of looking at all these little different textbooks. So these 40 pagers, 10 pagers, and then you get these larger ones being written, is you can see a window into the purpose, into the intention behind them. If you go track certain spots, go look in these Aristotelian textbooks like the Morton's, look under quality, look under, they all have the 10 categories, the 10 predicament, look under quality. If quality has habits, then look under habits and see, does it go then to a sort of psychology of faith and especially certainty. Well, this is where you see how things work. So we have 4 textbooks that I've given you, and one to Indians, very specific purpose, just to get them started. And the great thing about it is the Indians apparently used it themselves. This is what Gookin says is happening, is the Indians being trained by Eliot at first are then spreading out into the other towns, and they have this text. And then we move to this Ramus text, not very useful, but it really gives us an interesting window into Increase Mather's purpose. He has this great purpose for the college. And then we go to this third text with Charles Morton, by far the most interesting intellectual of all these. And his text, the most interesting, because sophisticated, and especially the way he pedagogically uses prose, diagrams, and poetry all mixed together. I didn't give you one of his poems, but it is sort of fun. And then Brattle's is the most dynamic, the one that he really wants to spur the students on into inquiry and on into what are enlightenment values. So in conclusion, you've got a model here that I've given you. I hope it's useful to you, in which you can see that this is happening. And so I encourage you to go look for others. I'm pretty sure that that they must be in the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, this kind of stuff going on at the same time, especially under the spirit of Juan Vives. Vives, Thomas More wrote of Vives. Thomas More, he said, he asked Erasmus rhetorically, who teaches better and more efficiently and more charmingly than Vives? Vives was up there with Melanchthon and these others, and so I suspect that Vives's inspiration would bring this kind of thing, this eclecticism and purposefulness into at least Spanish educational situations. And I understand, though, that the Spanish are more, their structures are more bureaucratic. The orders, Franciscan, Jesuit, Dominican, possibly more ordered and structured. And maybe they didn't have the freedom that the Puritans had for each tutor to sort of write their own textbook. There may be a difference there. But I suspect there must be some good work in Latin America. I wish I was in Latin America with you. I wish I could be part of your conference. I would learn a lot down there, and it would be a fun thing. And so, gracias and adios.